This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you, our readers. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture.
Welcome to Curious Minnesota. I'm your host, Eric Roper. Today's episode of Curious Minnesota is sponsored by Primrose Schools. If you've spent any time in South Minneapolis in the last 50 years, you may have run across the unusual intersection at Lake Street and Nicollet Avenue. These are two of the city's most important thoroughfares. But the city decided in the 1970s to close Nicollet at Lake Street so that a Kmart store could extend over a portion of 2 blocks. It was a controversial decision that later became known as one of the city's most notable urban planning mistakes. The city recently demolished the Kmart and is making plans to reopen Nicollet Avenue. Reader Larry Merwin wanted to know why the city closed the street.
About the same time as there's an article about what was going to happen to the Kmart site after it disappeared, I'd been to the Minnesota History Center and saw the display about streetcars in the Twin Cities. It's a pretty sophisticated network, and Nicollet Avenue had 2 main lines going down it, and Nicollet and Lake was a major intersection. So why disrupt that historically important transit route? And then aligned with that, why does it have to block Nicollet? Move it a block one way or a block the other way, block off a not so important side street, and you don't have to disrupt a major transit intersection. So that was the reason I asked the question.
Now, let me just say a lot has been written about this Kmart in recent years. Back when I covered the city of Minneapolis, I even spent an entire day there in 2018 collecting anecdotes for a story about the store's importance to the community. But today we're going to dig into why the city found itself in the position where it needed Kmart so badly. It began with a grand vision for this district. Tax subsidies helped demolish several blocks of commercial buildings in hopes of revitalizing the area. Then things went awry. Joining us today is Adelie Bergström, who documented this fascinating history for Curious Minnesota. Well, Adelie, thank you so much for joining us today. So people who are not familiar with this might be wondering, why are we talking about some random street getting closed in South Minneapolis? But folks in Minneapolis and folks who read this newspaper, this has been a topic for so long. But just tell us how important is this closure of Nicollet and this Kmart? It's like a punchline in here in town.
It is. It's that Kmart. Everybody knows that Kmart in Minneapolis. Won't be the case probably anymore. But yeah, for almost 50 years, there's this gigantic discount store right in the middle of not just any street in Minneapolis, not tucked into a corner, but literally blocking one of the major commercial streets of the city at the corner of another large commercial street. And that's not something that we usually see. You're not going to see blocking off, Lyndale Avenue, Snelling Avenue in St. Paul. You can extrapolate it to any city and imagine wherever you are, what if they built a store in the middle of the street?
Right. And it's mostly a parking lot.
Mostly a parking lot, right.
Which we're going to get to later because that was sort of part of the plan. Okay, so this sort of story begins in the late 1960s. So we have to set this up a bit and set up the desperation because part of the why here involves a lot of desperation in different ways. What's happening in the city by the late 60s? What's the vibe? What population-wise and otherwise?
Right. Minneapolis and cities across the country were losing population between the 1950s and sort of the 1980s as people fled out to the suburbs, as people sought more space, sort of that American dream. Businesses rushed out to cater to them and found cheaper land out in the suburbs. Infrastructure wasn't necessarily being kept up in the way that the city would have liked to. And part of that was because you had between 1950 and 1970, 87,000 people who had left the city of Minneapolis. And they took that property tax money, the income for the city with them. And part of that actually was 107,000 specifically white residents who had left the city, who had been, settled here for a long time.
So 87 is the net.
The net.
And 107,000 white people left.
And then other people moved in. And right. So you had a lot of sort of very established businesses, that presence leaving the city. And when you have that kind of, move in population, that's going to affect the amount of money coming into the city. And you have people coming in who are probably renting more than owning and all of that. And so that was where the city found itself. And at the time, the answer for the average person was, let's go out to the suburbs. We've got more room. Mm-hmm. But that leaves, some decay in the city.
But Lake Street is still a hoppin' commercial district. It's one of the biggest commercial districts in the Twin Cities at the time.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd call it hoppin', but it was.
Oh, right. Okay, we're going to talk about why it's not hopping. But it's still a big thoroughfare.
It's a big, So it was Minneapolis's main sort of auto lot row. University Avenue in St. Paul was the counterpart. And there were a lot of open businesses. They were not necessarily doing well. Their buildings didn't look good. The infrastructure was really suffering. With that tax money being taken out of the city, you just didn't have, you weren't able to come in and do these public works projects and facade uplifting and everything. Mm-hmm. And so yes, that was part of the issue. And so,
to the point that it not being hopping, there were studies you mentioned in the story about the amount of empty buildings.
Right, yeah. So on a 2-mile stretch, basically, that runs right through the area, they had identified, I believe it was nearly 80 buildings that were just empty, which is not a good look for a busy shopping street in a busy city.
Right. So this coincides with more federal interest in sort of helping cities sort of get out, because Minneapolis is not alone in having this problem. And so the Model Cities program is supposed to sort of help cities plan for the next generation, the future.
Right.
And that becomes applicable here. So how does that sort of apply to this?
Yeah. So just briefly, that was a federal program, Model Cities, that aimed to take a little bit more of a holistic approach to urban renewal, which was, very popular in the day, by involving the community who are living in the districts they had designated. And
as opposed to like Skid Row and what happened downtown.
Right. And as opposed to just bringing, people who didn't really have any vested interest in the community. There was some of that too, but they aimed to just balance that out a little bit better.
Yeah. So they designate most of South Central Minneapolis to be one of these model neighborhoods. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Okay. And that sort of is what starts the planning around what we're going to be talking about in essence.
Right.
And so Lake and Nicollet is identified as one of like the potential sort of target areas.
Right. So they hired a consultant in 1969 and he came in and said, hey, this neighborhood doesn't look as bad as maybe you think it does. It's still a viable place, but everything is way too spread out. It's overbuilt for the amount of people that are here. So he recommended centralizing the business districts around a few key intersections, of which one was Lake and Nicollet.
And how are people getting to these businesses?
Yeah, so he noted that there was a remarkable percentage of people who did not own cars in the neighborhood. They were on foot, they were taking the bus, and so that was another reason to sort of cluster businesses around key intersections to make it easier on the people who lived in the neighborhood and were getting places not using their car.
Right. So clustering businesses, it's the late 60s. People's minds start to turn to Southdale. I mean, we have the first indoor mall in America has opened. Actually, that was in the 50s, but, it's becoming the norm. And they asked this guy, right, like, could we do one of those here?
Right.
And what's his response?
His answer was, I don't think you should try it. He basically said, you're going to need to attract a big anchor store, and I don't think you can get one. And
that's
also
foreshadowing, listeners.
Yeah. And also, don't try to compete with the suburbs. The land is cheaper. There's a lot more space. You're going to have to do a lot of work to try to do that here, and it's not going to work. And so, don't try it. He said, your first order of business is to get the business that's already here.
Okay. So that was in 69, and then we fast forward to 72, and the city's like, okay, we've got a plan. And what is their plan?
Their plan is to build essentially a little Southdale in the middle of South Minneapolis, which is exactly what, this consultant said would be a bad idea.
And there's a rendering of this on the story that people should check out. But what's involved in this thing?
Yeah, so the plan was to clear basically 8 square blocks sort of surrounding Lake and Nicollet of the small buildings that were in bad shape there, move everybody out, pay them to relocate into a different spot. Eminent domain comes into this. So they did force people out to some degree. and then clear all that land, which takes money, and then build essentially a shopping center, couple buildings on either side of Lake Street with a second story that literally bridges across Lake Street, sort of, creating this big skyway sort of tunnel system.
Okay.
And so that was their idea. Later, they added another large sort of entertainment center with a bowling alley and a cinema and some other, and then just a glut of parking. So big parking ramps that had, 1,000 parking spaces or close to that. And
so this sort of coincides with the advent at the time of this tax subsidy concept called tax increment financing, which essentially seems to sort of say you can use the potential of this development to fuel all the money you're going to need to do the land clearance and whatever. So just briefly describe what's going on there, because this becomes very important later in the story.
Right. So tax increment financing, TIF financing, you probably have heard, or TIF, is basically a gamble on the city's part. They are borrowing money. They're selling city bonds to investors. So they use that money to fund development, and then they are gambling that the property tax money that comes from that development down the line will then allow the city to repay those bonds. So it's a gamble that, is this going to work?
We'll be right back.
At Primrose, our balanced learning approach means exploring academic skills and life skills, combining purposeful play with nurturing guidance from teachers, and setting children up for success in future classrooms. Learn more at primroseschools.com/Twin Cities.
And we're back. So they use this TIF, and what are they using it for? I mean, the city starts doing stuff, even though there's we don't know exactly what this thing's going to shape out to be.
Right. They kind of started acting before they maybe had a full plan. But yeah, so the TIF money was used to relocate businesses, buy them out, clear that land, and prepare it for development.
And we're not just talking about where the Kmart ended up, but it's actually a bigger district than that.
Right. It's 37.5 acres, 8 square blocks.
Okay. And we have a map on the story of which buildings were raised. And so, this was supposed to be this sort of very community program. I mean, but residents are saying, wait a minute, we're kind of getting left out of this whole thing.
Right. The residents basically said, we don't need a Southdale. Nobody needs that here. We need services. We need groceries. We need, everyday sundry items. We need a place that we can walk to. We need probably a place that doesn't have 1,000 parking spots. And I think they saw it as, some arrogance on the side of the city coming in and saying, well, we're going to do something different, basically. Mm-hmm.
So now it's the mid-1970s, and also this model cities program doesn't really exist anymore. The funding isn't there anymore.
Right. So that was a President Johnson thing in the 60s. Once Nixon comes in, he starts to take money from that. You also have a recession. You've got the oil crisis, 1973-74. It's just a really bad retail environment, especially.
Okay. So 1975, they've cleared all this land, but there's no commitments.
Right. They have a group of developers that they've hired, local developers who are tasked with finding an anchor store for the development. They did have interested tenants, but they were just little businesses. So they needed an anchor to underpin the entire thing.
So there's no anchor tenant, so that consultant was basically right, that was going to be tough.
Right. Tough retail environment. And then by getting an anchor tenant, that helps you then attract further tenants. And so that was a big push. Without that, you weren't really going to be able to build.
Yeah. So then we get back to this tax subsidy process. So now they're starting to realize that bills are going to come due that was supposed to be paid for. I mean, this project was supposed to pay for itself, and now they don't have anything to show for it to pay the bills back, pay the debt back.
Yep, the city was starting to panic. At one point, they said to the developers, we're going to take this over ourselves if you guys can't find something. They were really up against a wall in trying to figure out, okay, we've cleared this land. Maybe we shouldn't have, but we did. And so now we've got to figure out something to go here, because this is literally land that's sitting here and not doing anything for anybody, not making any money, not bringing anything in. So by 1975, they're worse off than they started, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Right, because they've got less tax base than where they started and all that. Okay, so then Kmart comes in, 76, and they're cool with this. They're ready to build, but they have a caveat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they said, hey, we'd love to build a store here, but we want to use our traditional format, which, you think about a Kmart store, big, huge parking lot in the front, and they wanted it to face Lake Street, straddling Nicollet Avenue. So they would have to essentially block Nicollet Avenue to build in the way they wanted to. The city, obviously, that wasn't an eloquent solution for them. They wanted, they asked Kmart to consider, potentially turning the store off to one side. Kmart didn't want to do that. They were worried about not having enough space for their parking, and the clock was ticking.
And so obviously this is not a great offer to the city, but they're getting pretty desperate over there at City Hall.
They're getting desperate, yeah. There's bond payments coming due soon, and in the meantime, they're having to dip into the city's general fund just to keep up what they've done, keep up the land, and that's
just to
costing...
pay back what they owe on the land.
Right. And so they were really backed into a corner.
Okay. So they say yes?
So they say yes. 1976, they say yes.
Okay.
The next summer, they close Nicollet and get started on this Kmart. So now traffic is going to be diverted onto Lake Street, northbound Nicollet traffic diverted onto Lake Street, onto First Avenue, and southbound traffic coming down Blaisdell. The neighborhood's not happy because these are smaller streets, they're more residential, and that's not great for residents of a neighborhood and kids and families, and so they're not happy about that. There was some talk of maybe trying to just bend Nicollet around the store, but that didn't work with the parking situation. And so they really, that was it at that point.
Okay. So Kmart opens in 1978. So they blew up all these blocks. So it took more years to get all these other blocks have some things on them to redevelop those.
Yeah. I mean, it literally took almost another decade before it was all full.
Okay. So by the 80s, when our paper is assessing this whole thing, I think it was one of the last parcels was getting filled in or something like that.
Yep.
What was the sort of ultimate financial tally from this whole thing?
Yeah, so by 1984, so a few years before that last spot was filled in, the city had spent $17 million on the project, and with most of that coming to the taxpayers, which is far and away more than they had planned on, having to spend. And so, but by the time that 1988 rolls around, that last parcel is developed. That's a great time for a look back. It's been 15 years since they started this. And the consensus is generally, look, this is here. It's working. The neighborhood is using the store. There is not another similar store anywhere near here. The closest one was the Target down on Hiawatha and Lake, which is several miles away. And so, generally speaking, Kmart settled in and became a neighborhood fixture.
They sort of traded the density of small businesses, some of which you can't predict what those would have been like if, maybe after the recession and whatever, they traded that for sort of like this more consolidated one business type thing, which did prove successful for that business. Right.
And successful for the neighborhood. I mean, obviously you've got a Kmart in the middle of a neighborhood that doesn't have a lot of other options. People are going to go there.
Right. And you have the sea of parking, which was always sort of part of the complaint, right?
Right. It doesn't look very nice.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So, but then I guess the other sort of like coda to this is that north of the Kmart in the 90s, this district called Eat Street develops, and some people you spoke with sort of see a correlation here.
Yeah, so behind Kmart, where Nicollet sort of ends behind Kmart, where it was blocked, there's a big wall there. They called it the Berlin Wall, which is my favorite thing ever. So it blocked traffic. There was less traffic on that northern part of Nicollet, which some argue allowed that part to develop sort of separately from the rest of Nicollet and allowed it to be a little bit more insulated from the traffic that would have been coming through there. And I spoke with Lou DeMars, who was the city council president through much of the 1970s. And he was one who said, I don't think this would have flourished in the way that it did if this had been sort of a gritty through street in the way that others. No, that's up for debate. But and that also, they redid the street in 1997, and that really kind of got things going as well.
Okay.
And Whittier, that neighborhood was really working on sort of, a facelift as well.
Right. So Kmart has had this long decline. There are not many of Kmart's around anymore.
Yeah.
And this one is also no longer around. So just what's the end story on this Kmart?
Yeah. So they, it closed in 2020. It had planned on closing anyway in 2020, but that was sped up a little bit by the unrest following the George Floyd murder. And the building was used for a post office for a short while afterwards. And the
city had bought the land.
The city bought the
land.
land.
They were like the landlord.
Right,
kind of. Okay.
Right. But so they're spending even more money. It was, millions of dollars to then buy that land and buy out Kmart's lease. Kmart's lease, the other part of this is that they had a lease going until like 2053. So it wasn't something that the city could just easily be like, we don't want it, so long. And as Kmart's fortunes started to dwindle in the sort of 90s, they did get a little bit more interested in maybe changing the store layout, maybe building a 2-story Kmart, something that would allow the city to reopen Nicollet. So the calls for reopening Nicollet, they came really right after the project started, honestly, but they really started to ramp up with the city in the late 90s. But here we are, 25 years later, and we're just finally at that point.
Right.
So Kmart closes. The city eventually bulldozes the store last year, and has gotten to work now on a new plan.
Right. It's kind of wild, you take the bus or you bike or whatever down Nicollet and you can see the other side. And I think the first time I saw that, it was just a revelation. I was like, oh my God, that's the other side of Lake Street, It's the
other side of the Berlin Wall.
Well, Adelie, thank you so much. Fascinating story. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.
Okay, that's it for today's show. Thanks, as always, to Matt Gilmer for editing this podcast. Do you have feedback for us or a question you'd like us to answer? Send us a note at curious@startribune.com. And if you're enjoying this show, please tell a friend about it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Curious Minnesota. We want to hear from you. Ask questions and read more stories online at startribune.com/curious. Our show is recorded at the Star Tribune's headquarters in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and our music is produced by Matt Gilmer. If you like the show, please rate us on iTunes or leave a review. And until next time, stay curious.